I just want to... Oh, I can't resist. I'm supposed to quit right here. But, oh, yes. But in view of the fast things that I just said, I don't know whether you know it or not, but I have a new hobby. I am collecting stories that I can actually prove are told among the Russian people. They make them up themselves, they tell them between themselves, reveals they got a great sense of humor, and they've also got a little cynical attitude about things in their country. And one of these stories, the one I'm going to tell you, I told to General Secretary Gorbachev, and he laughed. The story was an American and a Russian arguing about their two countries, and the American said, look, in my country, I can walk into the Oval Office, I can pound the president's desk and say, Mr. President, I don't like the way you're running our country. And the Russian said, I can do that. The American said, you can? He says, yes. I can go into the Kremlin, to the General Secretary's office, pound his desk and say, Mr. General Secretary, I don't like the way President Reagan's running his country. I've been collecting stories, jokes, that I can absolutely establish are told by the people behind the Iron Curtain in the communist bloc, which reveal they've got a great sense of humor, but they've also got a pretty cynical attitude toward their system. And this one has to do with the fact that in the Soviet Union, if you want to buy an automobile, there is a 10-year wait. And you go through quite a process when you're ready to buy, and then you put up the money in advance. So there was a young fellow there that had finally made it, and he was going through all the bureaus and agencies that he had to go through and signing all the papers, and finally got to that last agency where they put the stamp on it. And the man then that had made the final stamp of the paper, taking the money, said, all right, come back in 10 years and get delivery of your car. And he said, morning or afternoon? And the fella said, well, 10 years from now, what difference does it make? He said, the plumber's coming in the morning. Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, distinguished members of the Congress, honored guests, and fellow citizens. Today marks my first State of the Union address to you, a constitutional duty as old as our republic itself. President Washington began this tradition in 1790 after reminding the nation that the destiny of self-government and the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty is finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. For our friends in the press who place a high premium on accuracy, let me say, I did not actually hear George Washington say that. I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience. You know, I received an invitation that said, please come to Ellis Island July 4th for the 100th birthday celebration of an American institution. Somebody goofed. My birthday isn't until February. And it really won't be my 100th. Although I've been around for a while. I can remember when a hot story broke and the reporters would run in yelling, stop the chisels. Now, I know that a lot of you have been having some fun with my advancing years. You even tied my recent surgery to my age. Well, I got to be honest with you. I had that same operation when I was young, and it felt so good I wanted to have it done again before I was too old. But I am aware of my age. When I go in for a physical now, they no longer ask me how old I am. They just carbon date me. It reminds me a little bit of a cub reporter. You knew that something would remind me of a story. A cub reporter whose first solo assignment was interviewing a fellow who was just going to have a birthday that made him the oldest person in town. And he got to the address. It was an older building out in the outskirts of the city, and an elderly gentleman ushered him in. He sat down, and the reporter determined he was the man, and he said he was there for the interview, and he led right to the matter about how old are you, and the man said 96. He said, to what do you attribute your longevity? And the fellow said, I don't smoke, drink, or run around with wild women. And at that moment, there was a crash from upstairs. And the reporter looked up, and he said, what was that? And the old boy said, oh, that's Dad, he's drunk again. I can still remember my first Republican convention. Abraham Lincoln giving a speech that sent tingles down my spine. No, I have to confess, I wasn't actually there. The truth is, way back then, I belonged to the other party. Thank you all so very much. In all the 36 anniversaries of my 39th birthday, this has certainly been the most memorable. George, Barbara, all of you up here on the top shelf, together with me, and all of you, ladies and gentlemen, I am enormously touched. Yes, today is my birthday. 75 years ago, I was born in Tampico, Illinois, a little flat above the bank building. He didn't have any other contact with the bank than that. Now, here I am, sort of living above the store again. Thank you all very much. Please. Be seated, and welcome to the White House. I always feel self-conscious when I say that, and I say it every time I'm in here, but somehow technically, and that does kind of explain some of the problems of government, that this old executive office building is part of the White House. I haven't put my clothes in a single closet over here. With this great reception that you've given me, I have to say that there was once upon a time that to be a Republican in this area of the country felt a little bit like being Gary Cooper in High Noon, outnumbered in a big way. But I remember the story of a fellow who was running for office as a Republican, and he was in a rural area and that wasn't known to be Republican, and he stopped by a farm to do some campaigning. And when the farmer heard he was a Republican, his jaw dropped, and he said, wait right here till I go get Ma. She's never seen a Republican before. So he got her, and the candidate looked around for a podium from which to give his speech, and the only thing he could find was a pile of that stuff that Bess Truman took 35 years trying to get Harry to call fertilizer. So he got up on the mound, and when they came back, he gave his speech. And at the end of it, the farmer said, that's the first time I ever heard a Republican speech. And the candidate said, that's the first time I've ever given a Republican speech from a Democratic platform. There's nothing I enjoy more than a little country humor. One of the great things about having you here is that I get to tell a farm joke. Now, first I need a setting, but Rick, you're from Kansas, right?
You bet.
Okay, this takes place in Kansas. There was an old Kansas farmer there. He had a piece of creek bottom land that had never been developed at all. It was all rocks and brush and all messed up, and he started in on it, clearing it, the underbrush, and hauling away the rocks, then cultivating the soil there, and he planted a garden, everything from vegetables on to corn, and it really became a garden spot, and he was pretty proud of what he'd done. So one Sunday morning in church after the service, he asked the preacher if he wouldn't stop by to have a look. Well, the preacher arrived, and he took one look, and he said, "Oh, this is wonderful." He said, "These are the biggest tomatoes I've ever seen. Praise the Lord." He said, "Those green beans, that squash, those melons," he said, "the Lord really has blessed this place. And look at the height of that corn." He said, "The God has really been good." And the old boy was listening to all this, and he was getting more and more fidgety, and finally he blurted out, "Reverend, I wish you could have seen it when the Lord was doing it by himself." I do understand something about farmers' problems. I remember some years ago when Ezra Taft Benson was the Secretary of Agriculture, and he was out in a time of hardship, meeting with some farmers and hearing some of their problems. In one particular place, there was one man that was really giving him a bad time. His complaints were numerous, and he was going on about them, and finally Ezra turned to a staff member and looked at some notes that were shown him, and then turned back and said, "Well, now, wait a minute. You didn't have things all too bad here. Last year you had 29 inches of rain." And the man said, "Yes, I remember the night it happened." But this is the story of a realtor who was out driving on a back road on his way to look at some property, and suddenly noticed down beside him was a chicken keeping pace with him, and he was doing 60 miles an hour. And suddenly the chicken spurted out ahead of him, and it looked to him as if the chicken had 3 legs. And then it turned and went down a sign road and into a barnyard, and the driver turned down that lane, drove into the barnyard. There was a farmer there, and he asked him, he said, "Did you see a chicken go by here?" And the farmer said, "Yep." He says, "Did it have 3 legs?" And the farmer says, "Yep. I raise them that way. I breed them." He says, "You do?" He said, how come?" "Well," he said, "I just love the drumstick, and Ma always liked the drumstick, and now Junior's come along, and he likes it, and we just got tired of fighting over it. So I've been breeding 3-legged chickens." And the driver said, "Well, how do they taste?" He says, "I don't know. I haven't been able to catch one yet." I feel a little bit here like the man who was the farmer that was driving his horse and wagon to town for a load of grain and had a head-on collision with an automobile. He was lying there seriously injured. Even some of them were permanent disabilities. And later followed the usual legal procedures with the insurance company and all, and he was on the stand, and a lawyer said to him, "While you were lying there at the scene of the accident, didn't someone come up to you and ask you how you were feeling, and didn't you answer that you never felt better in your life?" Well, he said, yes, I remember that happening. Well, later on redirect, another lawyer was asking the question, and he said, "What were the circumstances when you gave that answer as to how you felt?" Well, he said, "I was lying there," and he said, "a car came up and a deputy sheriff got out. He said, my horse was neighing with pain and kicking. He had 2 broken legs. The deputy sheriff put the gun in his ear and put the horse out of his misery. He said, my dog had a broken back and was whining with pain, and he went over, did the same thing, put there and shot him. And then he came over to me and said, now, how are you feeling?" It seems that 25 of San Francisco's top bootleggers, this is a little story to illustrate what I've just said about candor. They were arrested back there in those days of the Volstead Act. And as they were being arraigned, the judge asked the usual question, of course, about their occupation. And the first 24 were all engaged in the same professional activity. each claimed he was a realtor. And then he got to the last one, the 25th, and says, "And what are you?" He asked the last prisoner, and the fellow says, "Your Honor, I'm a bootlegger." And the judge was surprised, but he laughed, and he said, "Well, how's business?" He said, "It'd be a lot better if there weren't so many realtors around." It reminds me a little bit of a story, and I hope I haven't told you this story before. But if I have, you got to remember that life not only begins at 40, but so does the tendency to start telling stories over and over again. And if I've told this story to you before, just be kind. Remember that when you pass 40, you begin to have a tendency toward lumbago and telling the same story over and over again. You know, I like to tell a story. If you've heard it before, if I've told it before, just remember that after age 40, you have a tendency to tell the same stories over and over again. Because you've got to remember that life not only begins at 40, but so does lumbago and the tendency to repeat the same story. But this is a story about, it was an automobile accident. There was a man stretched out there, and a woman was bending over him, trying to give some aid, and the crowd had begun to gather, and a man elbowed his way through the crowd, shoved the lady aside, and said, "Let me at him. I've had first aid training." And she meekly stepped back, and he went to work with all the things that he'd learned. And then at one point, she tapped him on the shoulder and said, "When you come to that part about calling the doctor, I'm right here." It's about a businessman who, just down at the entrance of his building, there was an elderly lady selling pretzels, and every day he'd go by and he'd put a quarter down and never take a pretzel, go on in. He was being very charitable, and this went on for some time. And he came along one day, put down his quarter, and she took him by the arm. And he looked at her and he said, "Oh, you probably want to know why for this full year I've been leaving 25 cents on the plate and not taking a pretzel." And she said, "No, I just wanted to tell you that pretzels are 35 cents now." This fellow was so successful that he was opening a branch office, and he decided to order a floral decoration for the occasion. When he got to the opening, he was shocked to see that the inscription on the floral flowers read, "Rest in peace." And on his way home, he stopped at the flower shop to register a complaint. And the shop owner heard him out and then said, "Well, take it easy. Things aren't that bad. Just remember that someplace today there's somebody opening something up, and it says, 'Good luck in your new location.'" Some of these cynical professional pessimists remind me of the story of a young performer who was auditioning for a hard-bitten theatrical agent. He wanted to get into vaudeville. And the agent, sitting out there in the theater all by himself with his cigar, said to the kid, "Okay, kid, let's see what you can do." Well, the young fellow walked up on the stage and then suddenly just took off. And he flew up and over the balcony, circled a couple of times, flew around the ceiling, came back to a perfect landing on the stage and took a bow. And the agent took the cigar out of his mouth and said, "Okay, kid, what else do you do beside bird imitations?" Down in Texas during the 1976 primary, they had me out knocking on doors. And I remember one kind of rural area. I'd been governor of California, but I wasn't all that well known in Texas, and I knocked on the door, and an old fellow in his undershirt and jeans came to the door, and I told him I was running for president, and having been in the occupation I'd been in for a number of years, I was kind of surprised when he asked me what I'd done for a living. And I told him I'd been an actor, and then he asked me what my name was. And I thought, well, maybe if I give him a hint. And so I said, well, my initials were RR. And with that, his face lit up, and he turned and he ran back into the house, and he was yelling, "Ma, Ma, come on out here quick. Roy Rogers is outside." I'm mindful, too, that bringing things to a good conclusion is always a tricky business. You were told that I was a sports announcer, WHO Des Moines. Well, back in those days, the great evangelist Amy Semple McPherson was making a tour of the country holding revival meetings, and one of them in Des Moines. Now, the station thought it would be a good idea, an enterprising public relations man, to interview Amy Semple McPherson. But why they picked a sports announcer to interview that noted evangelist, I'll never know. But there we stood in the studio, and I asked her several what I thought were appropriate questions, and then she answered graciously, but then went into a very fervent plea about the success of her meeting. And I sat down until suddenly I heard her saying goodnight to our radio audience, and I looked up at the clock, and there were only 4 minutes to go. Well, I didn't know enough about Amy Semple McPherson that I could fill 4 minutes. So I got up, and in those days of radio and disc jockeys and so forth, I started thanking the noted evangelist Amy Semple McPherson and so forth, but I did like this, which means get a record ready. And the fellow out in the control room through the window reached out. There was always records around there for such contingencies, and picked one up and put it on the table. And I said, ladies and gentlemen, we conclude this broadcast by the noted evangelist Amy Semple McPherson with a brief interlude of transcribed music. I expected nothing less than the Ave Maria. The Mills Brothers started singing Minnie the Moocher's Wedding Day. She never did say goodbye. She just slammed the studio door as she went out. I also feel a certain kinship with those of you who are members of the clergy. Now, this is a comparison that isn't always made, but politicians and clergy do have a lot in common. We both have to make speeches and keep our audiences interested. And I know I'm running a risk in telling members of the clergy a story about their own profession, but maybe it will be new to some of you. It has to do with a young minister who was very disturbed because sometime, particularly on those hot Sunday or Sunday mornings, he'd see his group nodding off while he was preaching his sermon, and he told about his distress to a more experienced and older clergyman who said that he'd had that same problem, but he'd found an answer to it. He said, when you see them and their eyes beginning to close, he said, you just insert a line in your sermon and say, last night I held another man's wife in my arms. And he said, they'll wake up. Well, it happened. There came a hot Sunday morning, and there they were, and the eyes were closing, and remembering, he said the line, last night I held in my arms a woman who was not my wife. Well, the first minister had told him that after he got them awake, he was to then say, that woman was my dear mother. And this young fellow said the line, and then said, I can't remember who she was. Fellow fell off a cliff, and as he was falling, grabbed a limb sticking out the side of the cliff and looked down 300 feet to the canyon floor below, and then looked up and said, Lord, if there's anyone up there, give me faith. Tell me what to do. And a voice from the heavens said, if you have faith, let go. He looked down at the canyon floor and then took another look up and says, is there anyone else up there? Now that I'm approaching the end of my presidency, I have to be careful about these waves of good feeling and where they might carry me. That's why I keep reminding myself of a trip that Nancy and I made to Ireland. We were in Cashel Rock, where St. Patrick is supposed to have raised the first cross in Ireland. And a young Irish guide was showing us through the ruins of the old cathedral where that took place. And then he took us through the ancient cemetery, and we came to one huge tombstone there. And the inscription on that tombstone was, remember me as you pass by, for as you are, so once was I. And as I am, you too will be, so be content to follow me. And that had proven too much for some Irishmen who had scratched underneath the inscription on the stone. To follow you, I am content. I wish I knew which way you went. I have to pause for a second. I've already told this to some of you, but to tell the rest, because I know that Father Hesburgh is here in the room someplace from Notre Dame. Back in the days of the great Knut Rockne, when Notre Dame was the giant of the football world, And I told this one, Bill, you'll have to hear it again. I told it in the car. There was a great football coach named Knute Rockne at Notre Dame University. And he had a turnout of so many men that he knew he would have to dismiss many of them before long. And he decided to kind of accelerate this selection system. So he got a soccer ball and he gathered them around. And he said, now, this is a soccer ball. And he said, just to kind of get started, and he said, I want you to remember, football is a game that takes courage. He said, I'm going to divide you up into two groups. And then we'll put the ball down between you, and the idea will be to kick the ball, to try and kick it over the other fellow's goal line. Now, he said, in the course of this, remember, you may have to kick a few shins. But he said, remember, football is a game of courage. And then he looked down, and the ball was gone. And he said, wait a minute, who took the soccer ball? And the littlest guy in the front rank on one side said, never mind the ball, Rock, when do we start kicking? You know, a favorite story of mine, I always remember one of the favorite stories, which puts me in mind of another story. It reminds me a little bit of the story of the man that took his young son-in-law out and was going to introduce him to golf, and told him all that he had to do, and teed up the ball, and the kid took a swing, and he missed the golf ball entirely, but hit a ant's nest there and into the air, and so lined up and took a crack at it, and again hit another gouge out of the ant's nest, and now there were ants flying all the way through the air, and as he lined up for the third try, two ants peeked out of the crater that he'd left, and one of them said, if we want to survive this, we better get on the ball. But I've always thought of the importance of communication and how much a part it plays in what you and I, what all of us are trying to do. And one day, a former place kicker with the Los Angeles Rams, who later became a sports announcer, Danny Villanueva, told me about communications. He said he'd been having dinner over at the home of a young ball player with the Dodgers. The young wife was bustling about getting the dinner ready. They were talking sports, and the baby started to cry. And over her shoulder, his busy wife said to the ball player, change the baby. And he was a young fella, and he was embarrassed in front of Danny, and he said, what do you mean, change the baby? I'm a ball player. That's not my line of work. And she turned around, put her hands on her hips, and she communicated. She said, look, Buster, you lay the diaper out like a diamond, you put second base on home plate, you put the baby's bottom on the pitcher's mound, you hook up first and third, slide home underneath, and if it starts to rain, the game ain't called, you start all over. You know, less than one family out of 7 in the Soviet Union owns an automobile. Most of the automobiles are driven by the bureaucrats. The government furnishes them and drivers and so forth. So an order went out one day to the police that anyone caught speeding, anyone, no matter who, gets a ticket. Well, Gorbachev came out of his country home, his dacha. He was late getting to the Kremlin. There was his limousine and driver waiting. He told the driver to get in the back seat, he'd drive, and down the road he went. They passed 2 motorcycle cops. One took out after him. And pretty soon he's back with his buddy, and his buddy says, well, did you give him a ticket? And he said, no. Well, he said, why not? Oh, he said, they're too important. Well, he said, we're told to give anybody a ticket, no matter who it is. Oh, he said, no, this one was too, I could. Well, he said, who was it? He said, I couldn't recognize him, but his driver was Gorbachev. One of the more recent ones that I heard was about the man walking along the street at night, Moscow. Soviet soldier called to him to halt. He started to run. The soldier shot him. And another man said, why did you do that? Well, he said, curfew. Well, he said, it isn't curfew yet. He said, I know. He's a friend of mine. I know where he lives. He couldn't have made it. I heard one about a fellow who went to the KGB to report that he lost his parrot. The KGB asked him why he was bothering them. Why didn't he just report it to the local police? Well, he answered, I just want you to know that I don't agree with a thing my parrot has to say. Which makes me think of a story. Everything makes me think of a story. About 3 dogs, an American dog and a Polish dog and a Russian dog. They were all having a visit, and the American dog was telling them about how things were in this country. He said, you know, you bark and you bark long enough, and then somebody comes along and gives you some meat. And the Polish dog said, what's meat? The Russian dog says, what's bark? I have to interrupt right here and tell you that in one of my visits, I won't name him, I don't want to embarrass him, but one of the heads of state that I met with on this visit, he gave me one while I was on the way. Told me the story about the 2 fellows in the Soviet Union that were walking down the street, and the one of them says, have we really achieved full communism? Is this it? Is this now full communism? And the other one said, oh, hell no, things are going to get a lot worse. Nancy, would you like to join me up here for, please? I know it's getting late, dear, but it's not often that we have so many people who've written about us and broadcast about us all together in one room like this, and I thought you might like to say a few nice words to them. They're all from the press and radio and television. Maybe just a friendly little greeting would do. How about just a word or two, something friendly, even one kind word?
I'm thinking.
Seriously, my friends, as always, we've had our share of laughs tonight at one another's expense, which is as it should be in a city where the issues are important and the passions run so deep. Maybe the fun and good nature of evenings like this is a good place to start.
So thank you for your hospitality, and thank you for inviting us. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
There aren't any words that can properly tell you how bittersweet these days are, and the things that we would like to say to all of you. You know, I keep remembering back, and not too far, when someplace along the line there would always be a picture of a president standing in the Oval Office, looking out the window, usually the picture from behind, and he's standing there, and then his words are quoted as a tag for that picture about, this is the loneliest place, and what a lonely, and so forth. I don't know about them. I haven't been lonely 1 minute. I think both of us have been aware every minute we're here that we're surrounded by you, by others who may not be here in this room today, but here in this house, but over there in the West Wing, well, just here in Washington, all a part of everything we came here to do, and it couldn't have been done without you. And we've all shared, and I like to think maybe it's kind of close to what happened 200 years ago. We were all revolutionaries, and the revolution has been a success. But there just aren't enough words to thank you for all that you've meant to all of us, and how hard it is to say goodbye to all of you. But as I say, the only thing that can make it bearable at all is to remember all that you did and how much of a team we did become. And God bless you all, and as I say, there just aren't words enough to express our appreciation to all of you. Thank you, and God bless you all.
Elaine said I should say something, but I'll never get through it. See? Thank you.
I think the band was going to play something. And if we're